Before diving into this intense and realistic story, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, like it, and share it with anyone you know who will be moved by it too. This helps a lot and makes all the difference around here. Guadalajara had changed, but not enough to erase from Renata Villaseñor's memory the paths she once walked hand in hand with her daughter. The city seemed grayer in her eyes, as if time had decided to accompany the mourning she had carried in her chest for 20 years. Renata, at 52, was a woman whose presence imposed silence, not because of her arrogance, but because of the story her eyes told without needing words. Owner of a fortune that grew amidst the chaos of business, she was an admired and feared businesswoman. But no one, not even her closest executives, knew that behind the million-dollar contracts and gala events, there was a void that no professional success had ever filled. She had spent the last few decades trying to convince herself that moving on was the only way out, and in a way, she had succeeded, until that day. It was a muggy Tuesday, nothing special. Renata had gone to the city center to resolve something trivial, a signature on a notarial document. The driver suggested they have lunch at a fancy restaurant nearby, but she declined with an almost absent-minded wave. Something, without her really understanding why, made her get out of the car and walk down a narrow street full of little shops and fruit stands. The heels of her shoes hit the uneven stone floor like an out-of-place echo in that simple setting. It was then that, without thinking much, he stopped in front of a taqueria. The sign was faded, the tables were colored plastic, and the smell of grilled onions drifted through the open door. It was a place where, clearly, no one would expect to see Renata Villaseñor, but she came in, and it was exactly there that the world she had built to protect herself completely collapsed. The taqueria had something nostalgic about it, as if time passed more slowly there. Renata sat at a table near the window, trying to understand what had brought her to that place. As she waited, she looked around with an analytical gaze, but there was a restlessness she couldn't name. The atmosphere was simple but welcoming, crooked pictures on the walls, a noisy fan spinning on the ceiling, and an old radio playing Mexican music that spoke of lost loves. It was then that his eyes fell on a young woman who was crossing the room with a tray in her hands. She had soft features, hair tied up in an unpretentious way, and a serene way of moving. Nothing about her stood out in a blatant way, but there was something small, almost imperceptible, that made Renata's blood run cold. When the girl approached the next table to deliver the orders, Renata saw the necklace, an antique golden medallion with a small blue stone in the center, exactly the same as the one Jimena was wearing the day she disappeared. It was impossible, or not. Renata felt short of breath for a moment. The world around him seemed to go silent. He tried to disguise the impact, but his hands were shaking under the table. It couldn't be a coincidence. That medallion was custom-made, one of a kind, a birthday present for his daughter when she was 5. She remembered perfectly the velvet box and the sparkle in Jimena's eyes when she opened the gift. She also remembered the day he disappeared with her. The waitress turned to Renata and asked naturally if she had already chosen her order. The voice was sweet, firm, and carried a local accent that sounded all too familiar. Renata took a while to respond. He took a closer look at the young woman's face, her features, her brown eyes that seemed to say more than she herself knew. And in that moment she knew this was no ordinary meeting. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand, but which would make her revisit everything she had spent her life trying to eatery. The waitress smiled slightly, waiting for the answer that never came. Renata, still in shock, mumbled something about tacos al pastor just to cover it up. When the young woman walked away to take the order to the kitchen, Renata remained still, feeling a heat rising in her temples. That feeling of déjà vu was not something that could be dispelled with logic. It was something instinctive, almost biological. The medallion, the eyes, the timbre of her voice. everything seemed to conspire against the silence she had imposed on her own past. And it was only when the young woman returned to the table with the dishes on the tray and a polite smile on her lips that Renata found the courage to ask her name. "Anna," she said with a slight nod. Anna, a common name. But the way she said it, almost shyly, carried a strange echo in Renata's ears, as if it were a musical note out of time, but still too familiar to ignore. The rest of lunch was a silent parade of jumbled thoughts. Renata barely touched her food. Her fork rested next to her plate while her mind began to weave connections, memories, hypotheses. When Anna approached again to leave the check, Renata risked another question, trying to sound casual. "That medallion, it's pretty. Was it a gift from someone?" Anna instinctively reached for the necklace. "I'm not sure. I've always had it. It's been with me since I was little. They told me it came with me when I was taken to the shelter." The sentence hit Renata like a dull hammer blow. "I was taken to the shelter." That wasn't just any sentence. It was the first concrete crack in the narrative. That detail was too specific, too coincidental. And in that moment, Renata knew she couldn't just walk away and go on with her life as if nothing had happened. Renata left the taqueria with heavy steps, as if she were walking inside a dense dream, where each movement took more effort than normal. The strong Guadalajara sun burned the asphalt, but she barely felt the heat. She was numb from the mixture of feelings that were coming to the surface with force. He got into the car without saying a word to the driver and asked him only to drive aimlessly for a few minutes. I needed to think. I needed to understand. The name Anna, the necklace, the story of the shelter, none of that could be just a coincidence. For the first time in years, he felt something like hope, but also a paralyzing fear. What if it wasn't? What if you were clinging to an illusion? But inside, something deeper than reason insisted on screaming. It was her. It was Jimena. That night, Renata couldn't sleep. She spent hours sitting in her old living room, where the furniture still held the scent of the childhood that had once lived there. He opened a box that hadn't been touched in years, a box of memories with old photos, childhood notes, drawings scribbled in colored pencil. Among them was a newspaper clipping, already yellowed by time. Girl missing under mysterious circumstances. The image of Jimena, with her blue dress with white bows and the gold necklace around her neck, still seemed alive. Renata ran her fingers over the photo, feeling the pain alive again, as if she had lost her daughter yesterday. But now, there was something different. A real possibility, a spark that rekindled everything she had buried, and she knew that from then on there would be no going back. She needed to find out who Anna was. I needed to know where she came from, and most of all, I needed to confirm without a shadow of a doubt that this young woman was her daughter. The next morning, Renata called an old acquaintance, a private detective she had hired years ago, in the first few months after Jimena's disappearance. His name was Vicente Herrera, a dry man with a deep voice and small eyes who always seemed suspicious of everything. Even though he had already retired, Renata knew that if anyone could help her investigate discreetly, it was him. He arranged to meet at a discreet cafe in the Chapultepec neighborhood, and when he found him, he poured out everything he had felt the day before. Vicente listened in silence, as he always did, without letting any judgment slip onto his face. When she finished, he simply said, "Let's start with the adoption story. If there's anything wrong, it will show up in the papers." Renata nodded. He knew that this search would be like touching an open wound, but he could no longer ignore what his heart was screaming. While Vicente began to gather information, Renata returned to the taqueria the next day, unannounced. This time, she didn't want to seem like a random customer. She sat at the same table waiting for Anna to show up. When she did, she smiled spontaneously, as if she was genuinely happy to see her again. "Back for tacos?" she joked. Renata smiled back, but there was something else in her eyes now. A restrained intensity, a silent desire to get closer. During the conversation, Anna told her that she had worked there. Since she was 17, and that she had grown up in a shelter on the outskirts of the city. She said she never knew much about her origins, only that she had been registered when she was a few years old, and that the documents had always seemed a bit confusing. Renata listened attentively, trying to control the emotions that danced inside her. Each detail was a piece that fit together in a puzzle that she knew all too well. The next day, Vicente returned with the first information. They sat down, again in the discreet cafe, and he placed a copy of Anna's adoption records on the table. "There's something strange here," he said, opening the folder with the calm typical of someone who has seen everything in life. Renata held her breath. Vicente explained that the documents had unusual gaps, incoherent dates, signatures that didn't match, and records made in different registry offices, as if someone had hastily stitched the paperwork together to give the appearance of legality. Furthermore, the supposed biological mother who had abandoned Anna had never been located, nor was she listed in any other official database. "This reeks of illegal adoption, Renata," he said as direct as ever. She felt her stomach turn. What until then had been just an intuition was beginning to take concrete, palpable, frightening form. Renata took the documents home and spent the entire night rereading each page, each line, as if she could find more hidden clues there. Her mind was racing. As her certainty grew, so did her fear of what she might discover next. For the first time in many years, she felt vulnerable, not out of weakness, but out of hope. And hope, as she well knew, was dangerous territory. Still, she decided to go to the shelter where Anna had first been registered. She arrived alone, without telling anyone, saying she was making a donation and would like to speak to someone in charge. The building was old, with peeling walls and a smell of moldy paper. A short woman with grey hair tied in a tight bun greeted her politely. Renata, hiding her tension, asked about the old records. The employee hesitated for a moment, but eventually led her to a dusty room where the physical files were still kept, a maze of folders and documents forgotten by time. Renata spent almost 2 hours in that stuffy room, leafing through old files with her hands covered in dust. With each folder I opened, I felt the weight of time, not just from the aged smell of the paper, but from the anguish that built up in my chest. When he finally found Anna's entry log, his heart raced. The document said the girl had been left at the gate of the shelter during the early hours of the morning, wrapped in a blanket, with a note saying simply, "She needs a home." No name, no clue as to origin. But there was something there that caught Renata's attention. The name of the person who had filled out the admission form, Lorena Rios. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. Lorena, Jimena's former nanny, the same one who disappeared without a trace on the day of the kidnapping. It was as if the pieces, after years of being thrown in the dark, began to fall into place before his eyes. Renata left the shelter with shaky legs. The mind did not stop. It was impossible for it to be a coincidence. Lorena had not only disappeared the day Jimena disappeared, she now emerged as the only concrete link between Anna and that devastating past. Back in the car, he called Vicente immediately. "I need you to find everything you can about Lorena Rios. Where she is, if she's alive, anything." Her voice was steady, but there was a desperation hidden between the words. Vicente, already familiar with the name since the time of the original research, did not hide his surprise. If this woman really did hand her daughter over to a shelter, we are talking about a much bigger scheme. Renata knew. The truth was beginning to emerge, but with it came a new kind of pain. The pain of facing that her daughter had not just been taken, but sold, discarded like an object by someone she trusted. In the following days, Vicente devoted himself entirely to the search for Lorena. He searched through old records, cross-referenced public registry data, spoke to old neighbors and even acquaintances from the time she worked with Renata. The information gradually emerged, like crumbs left by someone who wanted to disappear from the map. He discovered that, months after Jimena disappeared, Lorena had moved to a small town in the countryside under a different name. She lived with false documents, far from everything and everyone. But the most shocking thing was what came next. Vicente found old bank records with large deposits made shortly after her disappearance. She was paid, Renata. She received money from an account that I'm already tracking. This wasn't an impulse. It was a negotiation, he said, with the cold tone of someone who faces the truth without embellishment. Renata closed her eyes, feeling her stomach churn. The pain now had a name, a date, and a price. As the investigation progressed, Renata began to slowly get closer to Anna. He hadn't revealed anything yet. He needed solid evidence before any confrontation. But he began to frequent the taqueria frequently, creating casual conversations, trying to gather more details about the young woman's life without raising suspicions. Little by little, Anna seemed more at ease, telling small fragments of her childhood, her doubts about the past, and a constant feeling of not belonging that had always accompanied her. I never really felt like I was part of anything, you know? Like there was a missing piece that no one could name, he said in one of the conversations, with a vacant look in his eyes. Renata swallowed hard. She knew exactly what that piece was. But I also understood that, even though the truth was about to emerge, nothing would be simple from then on. Because revealing the truth didn't just mean getting a daughter back. It also meant destroying everything that young woman believed herself to be. It was on a rainy morning that Vicente showed up with the last missing piece. The bank account tracking had led to an unexpected name, Hugo Morales, a discreet man without any major financial transactions, but who had a direct connection to the shelter where Anna was registered. He was a frequent donor, made regular visits, and according to records, was the girl's informal guardian in her early years. He was too close all this time, Renata, and no one suspected anything, Vicente said with a somber expression. Renata remained silent, trying to remember that name. And then it came to light. Hugo was an outsourced employee of a company that was a partner of the foundation that Renata had worked for in the past, always on the sidelines, almost invisible. But now, he was showing himself to be a central piece in the plot. Vicente explained that he was probably the one responsible for keeping Anna under the eyes of the system, ensuring that no one would associate her with her true origins. He was the link between Lorena, the shelter, and the clandestine network. Renata felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. Hugo had been present in his daughter's life the entire time, posing as her protector when, in reality, he was an accomplice in the most cruel robbery anyone could commit. It was a kind of betrayal that hurt in layers, not just because of what was done, but because it happened under the eyes of the world, silently. That night she wrote everything down in a notebook. I needed to organize my ideas, facts, feelings. He reread the names, the data, the details that now formed a clear line of events. And there, in the silence of the old room, Renata made her decision. It was time to tell Anna the truth. She couldn't put it off any longer. As hard as it was, as much as it would change everything, she knew her daughter deserved to know who she really was. And most of all, he deserved the chance to decide what to do with that truth. Renata spent the day mentally rehearsing what she would say. She repeated phrases, tried to predict reactions, but nothing seemed to make sense outside of the realm of imagination. Late in the afternoon, she went to the taqueria once more, but this time she didn't order anything. When Anna approached, smiling as usual, Renata stopped her with a serious look. "I need to talk to you, but not here." Anna found her tone strange, hesitated for a second, but something in the woman's expression made her accept without argument. They left together, walking in silence through the streets still wet from the recent rain, until they reached a discreet cafe on a quiet corner. They sat at a table in the back, far from any distractions. Renata took a deep breath, holding Anna's gaze, and began to tell her everything, from Jimena's disappearance, the necklace, the investigation, Lorena, Hugo, the false documents. The words came out with difficulty, But without beating around the bush, it was the naked, raw, and inevitable truth. Anna listened to everything in silence, motionless, as if the world had stopped around her. When Renata finished, the silence that formed seemed as heavy as the revelation itself. For long seconds, Anna said nothing. She just stared into space, trying to process everything. It was as if her entire identity was shattering before her. "Are you saying that I'm your daughter?" she asked, her voice breaking. Renata nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know it's hard, and I don't expect you to believe me just because I say it, but everything is here. The documents, the records. I've spent the last few days connecting the dots, and it all leads back to you." Anna ran her hands over her face, trying to hold back her tears. "My whole life was a lie," she whispered. Renata wanted to say something that would ease that pain, but she knew that no words would be enough at that moment. All she could do was be there, present, and hold tight the space between the truths revealed and the time it would take for them to heal. If this story has kept you hooked so far, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who also needs to experience this type of narrative firsthand. Let's make more stories like this reach those who need to hear it. Anna left the cafe without saying anything else. She walked quickly, as if escaping her own steps were possible. Renata didn't try to stop her. She knew that escape was necessary. It was her body trying to process what her mind still couldn't organize. Anna spent the night awake. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, reliving every detail of that conversation. The images of her childhood in the shelter, the faces of her caregivers, the few friends she had made. Everything seemed distant now, a staged scene, a rehearsed play. The necklace, which she had always thought was just pretty, now took on an unbearable weight. She touched the medallion with her fingers, as if searching for a truth in it that she still couldn't accept. She thought about Hugo, about the fatherly way he had always treated her, about the times he had mysteriously appeared to help her with simple things, a late rent, a new job, a piece of advice at the wrong time. Everything that had once seemed like care now seemed like control. The next day, Anna didn't go to work. She turned off her cell phone and stayed locked in her house, trying to understand where her own story began and ended. Late in the afternoon, she picked up the documents that Renata had left with her and began to read them. Each page was like a wound being reopened. False records, doctored dates, Lorena's name, the bank deposits. When he reached Hugo's name, he felt anger rise in his chest. That hurt more than anything, because he was the one who had been by her side for so long, and he was the one who had lied the most. For the first time in years, he felt hatred, a silent, contained, but real hatred. That kind of feeling that arises when pain finds a direction. And in that instant, a decision began to grow within her. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but he could at least find out the whole truth, all the way to the end. The next morning, Anna knocked on Renata's apartment door. The businesswoman opened the door with a slight look of fear in her eyes, surprised to see her there so early. Anna was serious, but there was firmness in her eyes. "I want to see where it all happened, where you lived, where I grew up, before all this." Renata hesitated for a moment, but soon made room for her to enter. They walked together through the house that had been the home of the Villaseñor family. Each room seemed to hold a piece of her childhood that Anna didn't remember, but which gradually awakened strange sensations, like a familiar smell, a forgotten touch, a distant echo. In the room that was once Jimena's, now preserved as a time capsule, Anna stopped for long minutes. The toys were still in the same place, the small bookshelf with children's books, the rug with colorful drawings, and even a worn-out rag doll that inexplicably brought tears to her eyes. Renata watched her in silence, respecting the timing of each step. She didn't want to invade anything, she just wanted to be there, in case Anna needed her. And in an almost instinctive gesture, the young woman sat on the floor, holding the doll tightly. "I don't know if I believe everything yet, but I felt this," she said, her voice trembling. It was the first sign that the connection between them was beginning to build, not by imposition, but by something deeper. Renata knelt beside her, placing her hand on her shoulder but without pressing. "There's no need to rush or know everything now. I just want you to know that I never stopped looking for you." Anna didn't answer, but remained there with her head down and her eyes filled with tears, as if for the first time she had allowed herself to feel everything that had always been kept inside, and that now, finally, had found space to come to the surface. In the days that followed, Anna began to slowly distance herself from the life she knew. She resigned from the taqueria without much detail, cut off contact with some people close to her, and sank into a silence that, at first glance, seemed strange. But for her, it was necessary. It was as if she needed to empty everything before deciding what she wanted to rebuild. Renata respected this process, even though she was anxious to fill in the lost years. Instead of pressuring, she began to send brief messages, subtle invitations for coffee, a walk, dinner. Sometimes Anna accepted, other times she didn't. But little by little, the gap between them began to narrow. There were moments of discomfort, long silences, averted glances, but there were also shy laughs, exchanged stories, and small discoveries of unexpected affinities. The relationship was still fragile, but it was real, and that, for Renata, was already more than anything she had dreamed of in the last 20 years. It was during one of these meetings that Anna spoke openly about Hugo for the first time. They were in a park, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of an old tree, watching children playing in the distance. He was always there, you know. Never invasive, but he always showed up when I needed him most. I thought it was luck, that destiny sent me. Someone good. Now I see that it was disguised surveillance. Renata listened in silence, feeling a tightness in her chest. Anna continued, "I don't know if I can forgive him, not because he was part of this, but because he made me believe that someone cared about me when everything was controlled." The words came out with difficulty, as if they were being torn out. Renata took her hand firmly. "You have every right to feel this way, but don't let this pain erase who you are. You are much more than what they did to you." Anna looked at her, for the first time with an expression that mixed pain and admiration. It was the beginning of a bond that, although wounded, was beginning to grow stronger. Despite the attempt at reconstruction, the past was not silenced so easily. Vicente warned Renata that Hugo was aware of the investigations and had disappeared in recent days. He was not just any man. He knew how to disappear, how to cover his tracks, and that made Renata fear that danger still lurked around Anna. "He might try to interfere," Vicente said, his voice deep and firm. Renata didn't want to scare her daughter, but she started to take extra care. He discreetly hired private security to protect her from a distance. It wasn't paranoia, it was caution. Anna, in turn, also felt this strange presence, this discomfort in the air. She began to look back more often on the streets, avoided empty paths, and one night she swore she saw someone standing across the street, watching her. Nothing happened, but the discomfort was enough for him to accept Renata's invitation to spend a few days at her house. During this period, something changed between them. Their daily coexistence brought not only comfort, but also confrontation. Some conversations were difficult, others disconcerting, but it was there, between improvised breakfasts and sessions watching old movies on the couch, that Anna began to feel something new, belonging. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt like she was in transit or out of place. That house, with its smells, sounds, and silences, began to become familiar, and Renata, even as she tried to control her anxiety about filling in the lost 20 years, respected Anna's time. One day, while they were leafing through an old album, Anna found a photo of a young Jimena wearing the same medallion. She remained silent for a few minutes, staring at the image. Then she said softly, "I see myself in her, and yet I feel different." Renata smiled, sadly. "Maybe you are both, And maybe that's where your strength lies. For the first time, Anna didn't argue. She just kept looking at the photo, as if she were finally beginning to recognize herself there. But the newly found peace was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. Vicente informed her that Hugo had been located in a neighboring city, staying in a cheap hotel under a false name. The police were already involved, and the arrest would be a matter of hours, but Renata hesitated. She wanted Anna to have a say in this decision. She wanted her to choose whether she wanted to confront him or let justice take its course. When she told her daughter, Anna took a while to react. She paced the room, breathing deeply, her fists clenched. Part of me wants to look him in the eye and ask why. Why did they steal my life? But another part just wants him to disappear and disappear from my story. Renata respected the conflict. She knew it was not an easy choice. And in the end, Anna asked only to write a letter. A single letter, with everything she wanted to say. No filters, no shouting, just the truth. The letter was delivered by Vicente, personally, before the arrest was carried out. No one knew what Hugo did when he read it. But Anna, after writing it, felt something she had never felt before. Lightness. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't complete peace, but it was a step. And sometimes one step is enough. In the days that followed, the atmosphere changed. The nights became quieter, the days less tense. Anna started sleeping better, smiling more often, talking about plans. Small, simple, but plans. She started a photography course, reconnected with old friends, and visited new places with Renata. The wounds were still there, but they were no longer open. They were scars, marks that told a story, but didn't define the future. And that, for Anna, was true freedom. For the first time, she felt like she could write what came next, in your own words. Over time, Anna began to call Renata Mom. It wasn't a rehearsed moment, nor a rational decision. The word simply slipped out in an everyday conversation, in the middle of a banal sentence. Mom, can you help me with this? And then there was a slight silence between the two, followed by a restrained smile on Renata's lips. They didn't talk about it afterwards. They didn't need to. That word spoken effortlessly was worth more than any speech. It was the symbol of something that was built little by little, with care, with patience, with truth. Renata knew that she would never have her 20 years back, but she understood now that love is not measured in time, but in presence. And she was there, wholeheartedly, for every step Anna decided to take from then on. One day, Anna took Renata to the shelter where she grew up. She wanted her to see where she had lived, where she had learned to defend herself from the world. They walked through the narrow hallways, looked at the shared rooms, and talked to a former employee who still worked there. Renata listened attentively to every memory, every story, every pain. And for the first time, she was able to see her daughter in that space too. Not only in the luxurious house where Jimena grew up, but also there, in that harsh environment where Anna learned to be strong. As they left, Anna held Renata's hand firmly and said, I am both, the girl who disappeared and the woman who survived. I don't want to erase any part of myself. Renata simply replied, then let's live with all of them. Because I didn't lose my daughter, I found a whole woman again. And in that silent embrace, where there were no more questions or answers, only the warmth of two lives that were finally reconnecting, everything made sense. Perhaps there was no reparation for the past, but there was a future that could still be written together. As the months went by, Anna and Renata's story began to take on lighter contours, even with the marks still visible. They decided to take a trip together, something symbolic, a new beginning far from the settings that held so many memories. They chose the Pacific coast, a small town with dirt streets, simple restaurants and calm seas. For the first time, they allowed themselves to laugh without guilt, talk about trivialities, create memories without the shadow of the past. Renata watched Anna with admiration, the way she expressed herself, the way she moved with more confidence, the way she began to occupy the space that had always been denied to her. And Anna, little by little, began to realize that the love Renata offered did not come from a place of obligation, but from a genuine, deep, silent affection. It was as if, in each simple gesture, there was a real attempt to reconstruct a story without forcing the bonds, but sewing them together carefully. One afternoon, sitting by the sea with her bare feet in the sand, Anna shared something she had never said out loud. For a long time, I thought no one would find me, that my life would always be this jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. Renata said nothing at that moment. She just smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. That confession was enough. There, in that simplicity, was more depth than in any grandiose declaration. It was the clearest sign that even without fixing the past, the present could be rebuilt with dignity, affection, and truth. And that late afternoon, with the sound of the sea filling the gaps of silence between mother and daughter, there was no more room for emptiness, only for that which finally was being reborn between them: life. After the trip, Anna decided to officially change her last name. He wanted to keep Villaseñor, not as a way of erasing the past, but as a symbolic gesture of belonging, a way of affirming that, despite everything, that was also his story. The process was simple but full of meaning. When he received the new document in his hands, he stared at the full name printed there for minutes. It was more than an identification. It was a rebirth, and Renata, upon seeing her daughter sign that paper, felt as if she was closing a cycle that, for a long time, she believed was impossible to complete. There were no grand celebrations or rehearsed speeches, just a tight hug and a comfortable silence. This was how a story marked by pain ended, with small gestures that said much more than words. Today, Anna continues her life with firm steps. There are still days when she feels the weight of what she experienced. She still carries unanswered questions, but she is no longer trapped by them. She moves forward with awareness, with roots, and with history. And Renata, even with the marks of absence, found in the current presence of her daughter a new reason to exist. They did not make up for lost time, but they built a new time. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. The pain was not forgotten, but transformed. And if there is something that this story taught them both, it was that true. Love does not disappear with time, nor with distance, nor even with lies. It remains, it resists. And sometimes, when all seems lost, it is true love that reappears, in the gaze of a daughter, in the touch of a hand, in the reunion that changes everything. Because even after so much silence, life still knows how to write endings of hope. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, like it, activate the bell, and send it to someone you know will feel it too. Stories like this deserve to be shared.